All right, so get this.
A prince
Okay.
raised in total luxury.
Discovers he's actually one of the oppressed. Talk about an identity crisis, right?
Yeah,
It has to work.
looking at today using Inside the Mind of Moses
Right.
to unpack this reluctant leader's inner world.
Yeah, it's one thing to hear that classic Moses story,
But
but
this book really digs into like the psychology of it all.
totally.
How does someone go from like Egyptian royalty to leading a rebellion?
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's not your typical hero's journey. It starts with baby Moses found floating on the Nile.
Right.
You know the story, rescued by Pharaoh's daughter.
Mm-hmm.
But here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
He's adopted into the very family that ordered the deaths of Hebrew baby boys.
Oh, wow.
Can you imagine? Talk about inner turmoil.
Yeah, talk about a messed up situation.
He's surrounded by opulence, the finest education.
But it's all built on the backs of his own people.
It's almost like I don't even know if you'd call it, it's just like a bizarre irony,
Totally.
That's not just uncomfortable, that's like a breeding ground for
Yeah.
some serious...
Cognitive dissonance, right?
Yeah.
And the book even mentions an ache Moses felt even before he like fully understood his heritage.
What do you make of that?
Well, I think that's something that we all kind of have, right? This
So like primal sense of when things aren't right.
Yeah.
Yeah, you just get that feeling.
Like you can just feel it in your gut.
That something's off, even before you can put it into words.
Totally.
And that's likely what Moses was experiencing, right?
Right.
He could sense the suffering around him, even if he was too young to really understand it. And that dissonance must have been amplified by like the sheer extravagance of the palace, right?
Oh, absolutely.
It wasn't just knowing, oh, my people are out
Suffering. It was being surrounded by the evidence of their suffering.
Yeah.
Every jewel, every tapestry.
It's like this constant visual reminder of the disparity between his life and theirs.
Totally.
Like imagine the guilt, right? The potential for survivor's remorse,
Mm-hmm.
even if he couldn't consciously process it at the time.
Right.
So we have Moses wrestling with this internal conflict, this pull towards a people he doesn't even fully understand, and then boom, everything comes to a head.
Inside the Mind of Moses lays it out. He sees an Egyptian overseer beating a Hebrew slave.
It goes from like this, sense of unease to like this brutal, visceral encounter with what oppression really is.
And his reaction, he kills the overseer.
Was this a heat of the moment decision, or had this been simmering below the surface for years?
Well, I think it's important to consider, like, the psychological weight of his upbringing. Imagine the pressure of trying to reconcile his Hebrew identity with the morality of the Egyptian court.
Oh, absolutely.
Right. And then to be confronted with that kind of raw brutality, it's a lot. This act, while extreme, you can see it as the culmination of years of internal conflict.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So he goes from this conflicted prince to like, well, a killer.
Yeah.
It's definitely a turning point in his story, but not exactly a heroic one.
No.
What do you think's going on in Moses' head after this?
Well, Inside the Mind of Moses really dives into this idea of moral injury here.
It goes way deeper than just typical guilt or remorse.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's more like this deep trauma of going against your core values,
Even if you think you're fighting for what's right.
which is so interesting.
Because, like, on the surface, it seems like this victory, right?
Right.
He stood up to oppression, defended someone who needed it.
But the psychological cost is huge.
Absolutely.
He leaves everything he knows, escapes from Egypt.
Could that be part of the moral injury?
I think so.
This escape wasn't just about, like, physical safety.
It was probably also an attempt to escape all that mental anguish.
To get away from it all.
Exactly.
He trades the luxury of Egypt for the isolation of the wilderness. Talk about an upheaval.
Yeah, huge change.
Makes you wonder how much his identity was tied to those external things.
Going from a prince to a shepherd, almost like he was stripped bare.
Right.
Forced to confront his true self.
It's in that desolate place, far away from everything.
That he encounters the divine,
Oh, here we go.
the burning bush.
I mean, talk about an intense situation.
Yeah, how wild is that?
Like you're dealing with all this guilt and doubt,
And suddenly a bush is talking to you.
and not just like a regular bush.
It's on fire.
And then it gets even more interesting, right?
Okay.
The voice from this burning bush says, I am. WHOIM.
It's like this very personal message.
Not just about God revealing himself, but it speaks directly to Moses' own identity crisis.
Wow, that's deep.
He's lost his title, his possessions, his whole way of life.
And then God tells him to figure out who he really is.
That's intense.
Talk about an intense therapy session.
Right.
But you have to think, even with that encounter, he's got to have some doubts.
Oh, absolutely.
And that's what's highlighted in the book.
Even when face to face with the divine, Moses still questions himself.
He asks, who am I to do this?
It's such a human response, makes him so relatable.
Yeah, it really does.
We put these biblical figures on a pedestal, but they were just as flawed and unsure of themselves as we are.
Exactly.
So how does Moses go from who am I to leading a nation?
So we have Moses accepting this mission, really becoming this reluctant leader.
Yeah.
But like inside the mind of Moses points out, it wasn't all smooth sailing from there.
Oh, not at all. And that's what I think is so cool about this book, you know?
It doesn't shy away from the fact that even with like a direct line to God.
Moses totally messed up.
Oh, yeah.
Like a lot.
He made mistakes.
Got angry, frustrated.
Even argued with God.
Which honestly makes him so much more relatable. Totally. If Moses struggled with the burning bush, the 10 Commandments.
It gives the rest of us permission to say, hey, I don't have it all figured out either.
Right. It makes you realize that even those biblical figures, they weren't perfect.
Not at all.
They were human, just like us.
And what's interesting is that the book argues that his flaws.
Those imperfections actually made him a better leader.
Exactly.
It was his willingness to admit he didn't know everything.
Yeah, his humility.
His reliance on something bigger than himself.
And his empathy for those Israelites, even when they were being difficult.
They were a handful.
That's what made him so effective.
Those weren't weaknesses. Those were his strength.
There's a powerful lesson in there for sure. But, I mean, we can't talk about Moses without talking about his legacy, right?
Of course not.
Leading the Israelites to freedom, delivering the 10 Commandments.
That's huge.
Absolutely. But I think what's important to remember from inside the mind of Moses is that he's more than just his accomplishments.
He was a man who really felt the weight of his decisions. He struggled with doubt, even when God was right there with him.
It's easy to view these historical figures as almost mythical.
Larger than life.
But this book really brings him back down to earth.
Exactly.
It reminds us that he was human, with all the complexities and contradictions that come with that.
And that's what makes these stories resonate, right?
It makes you think, if Moses, this seemingly superhuman figure,
if he could overcome his inner turmoil to achieve great things.
What about us?
Right.
What about our potential, even when we feel inadequate?
That's the question, isn't it? What impossible tasks are we being called towards?
Even when we're afraid.
Maybe if Moses could find his strength, his voice out in the wilderness.
Maybe we can too.
Maybe by understanding his struggles, his very human experience.
We can find a little bit of ourselves in his journey.
And on that note, we'll leave you all to ponder your own burning bush moments.
What seemingly impossible challenges are calling out to you.
Until next time, keep diving deep.